Kia ora, kouwhu smithaho, nā mai ki te whare, welcome to the House. Today on the House we step outside Parliament, and in fact back in time, to picture the parliamentary precinct and its neighbourhood in the late 19th century. But first, let me set the scene by going back even further. Before Europeans flooded in, the area of Wellington where Parliament now is, Pipitea, was a place of Māori habitation and cultivation. Parliament's wee hill had a creek flowing past to a small beach at the bottom. When the unscrupulous Edward Gibbon Wakefield's Wellington Company turned up and began selling off land that they didn't really own, he reserved land for himself, just about there, which made it the centre of things, where they later put the provincial chamber, the governor's house, and now Parliament and government. Within 50 years of all of that, the beach was gone, the forested hills were bald, and the Europeans were thick on the ground. For a picture of Pipitea in the 1890s, I wandered and chatted with an historian who has recently published an extraordinary, beautiful and fascinating book.
So my name's Elizabeth Cox and I've recently written a book called Mr Ward's Map, Victorian Wellington Street by Street.
Which is a massive tome which builds a history of Wellington based on an incredibly detailed map that was constructed in the 1890s.
Yeah, so Thomas Ward was a surveyor and an engineer, and he approached the City Council to say, how about I make a map for you? Because he was disgusted by the quality of all the maps that were around of Wellington at the time. So originally he was just going to draw the town acres and the subdivisions and the roads, but about 4 months later he approached the council again and said, I've had this fabulous idea, how about I draw all the buildings as well? So he drew every single building in Wellington, every outbuilding, every outdoor toilet, every shed, every commercial building, every house. And then he went further, he also told us what the walls of every building were made of,
so
what the roof
where they're
was made of.
corrugated iron, where,
Yep.
where it's wood, all those sorts of things.
all those sort of things. And then how many rooms every house had and how many floors there were. But it's even more valuable because for the next 10 years he was updating the map. So every time someone pulled down a house or a building and put up a new one, he'd come along and paste a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of paper over the top and then draw the new building over the top.
So it gets you see the change over
Yeah,
time.
so I can actually see those tiny pieces of paper and see where the changes have been made to the city.
We're standing at the moment outside what is now the Parliamentary Library, which is on a little hill above the bigger hill that Parliament sits on. It's kind of difficult to imagine what this area would have been like in the 1890s, although this building behind us was here then.
Yes.
Or a version of it.
The Parliamentary Library was here, but all the other buildings that Wellingtonians and New Zealanders are familiar with, they weren't here. There were parliamentary buildings on this precinct, but they all burned down apart from the library in 1907, and so they were all replaced. The other major building that was in this precinct, the parliamentary precinct, where the beehive is, was the house that the governor lived in.
It's extraordinary. Yes, the Governor-General, who now lives over by the Mount Vic Tunnel behind Wellington College, was where the beehive is.
Yeah, incredibly public place to live. You know, the wives and kids and stuff would wander around in the garden and kind of be on public display in a way.
Yeah.
So we had a series of governors during the 1890s when my book's set, and they were all sort of minor aristocracy from England.
They were all English toffs, weren't
yeah.
they? Did really not want to be in the colonies. Actually, the statue over there of Richard John Seddon, racist and misogynistic, and this guy here, Balance, this is their era.
Absolutely, yes. So these, Balance and Seddon, are the two Prime Ministers who were in charge of the country during the period of the 1890s when I studied it. Balance, I think, was a much nicer man, in my opinion. He died during the era I was studying. He lived at Premier House, which people will know is up in Tinakuri Road, which is the house set aside for the Prime Ministers. There was an enormous funeral. It was a really sad time for the country. But actually Seddon
that guy over there, he lived just up the street, didn't he?
He did. He chose not to live in the big posh house.
Because he was a populist and
yes,
he wanted to be more like a man of the people.
Modest and yeah, so he lived on Molesworth Street, just up the road here, in a much more modest house with his wife Louisa and many children. Louisa fascinates me because she was married to this man, as you say, who was pretty hard work. She was a really strong feminist. She was tough and really interested in politics.
And very much activating for women to have the vote,
suffrage,
while her husband was
absolutely.
dead against it.
I know, fascinating.
Despite the fact he tried to take credit for it after it had happened.
Of course.
Yeah.
One of her sons describes their house as being politics, breakfast, lunch and dinner, always. And so Seddon would have his cabinet meetings sometimes in the house, and then Louisa, was having suffrage meetings in the house as well, so it was pretty cool.
It is pretty cool. There was a road right through the middle of this, wasn't there? There was a street that went right across Parliament Lawn, right through what is now Parliament House, out to the back, Sydney Street East, one of the Sydney streets.
Yeah.
And when they built that building, they closed off Sydney Street, which used to connect with Museum Street at the back. Museum Street, just behind Parliament, which really is just a driveway these days, actually had a museum on it.
It did. It was called the Colonial Museum, and it was the country's museum, and it was set up by some of our very first, most important scientists.
Like Mr. Hector, who ran it.
James Hector.
Who ran everything, it seems.
He did seem to run everything. He was the country's meteorologist and all sorts of things, ran the Botanic Gardens just up the road from here. But I've also found some fabulous descriptions of it being an incredibly boring place to visit.
Because it was a research museum and not a sort of take the kids to it museum.
Yeah, there were massive whale skeletons hanging up and stuff like that, but I don't know if it was incredibly fascinating.
And it looks fun in the pictures.
Yeah.
But just across here, like Molesworth Street and Hill Street are the sort of the two streets that are on north and east of Parliament. Hill Street, behind us here, the Catholics were always here. The Anglicans hadn't arrived yet, with a warring cathedral right next door.
That's right. So they were slightly further away. They were on Mulgrave Street, so one block that way was St Paul's, which is now Old St Paul's.
Yeah. And in the Catholic precinct, there was a school for delinquent children.
Yes, it was called an industrial school. It was not in a very pleasant place at all, I should think. So it was run by the Society of Mary, and it was sort of like an orphanage, but you didn't necessarily have to have your parents have died to end up there. Sometimes if your mother just wasn't coping, or if your father left the family and therefore your mother couldn't afford to look after you, they would take your children off you and put you in one of these industrial schools.
Where they would be gently looked after by the nuns.
Well,
makes me think of Ireland.
Yes, well, so even from 7 years old, they were learning how to work. They were learning how to knit and sew to become good wives and good domestic servants. It was a lot of focus on training them up to be domestic servants.
Let's walk up there. We have to go past what is now the Parliamentary Library, which has a weird little history of being built in the first place, being designed by, what was his name?
Thomas Turnbull.
Thomas Turnbull. His design was full of fripperies, right?
Yes. So he asked for his name to be taken off the foundation stone because he didn't approve of what had happened during the process of it being finished.
That ensmoldified it slightly.
Yes.
It's one of those political things where halfway through building a building you decide that really you can't afford it, and
Indeed.
so you make it, a story shorter and take off some of the crenellations and towers.
That's right. Seddon was really fussed about having a much better parliamentary precinct to kind of be the backdrop for all the photographs of him doing impressive things, and so this was one of the buildings that he had built. But the other buildings that had been here when he started his premiership, he actually had them pulled down. One of them during the time when all the MPs were out of Wellington.
So he demolished the building without asking the MPs?
Yeah, it was very controversial, and also at the time there wasn't a lot of money in the country, so it was controversial for the fact that he was spending all this money. So, and that's the building that burned down in 1907. Yeah. Everything burned down apart from the library.
Gosh, demolishing a building without asking anyone is reminiscent of something happening about now. And then when they eventually built the big grey edifice that's Parliament House during World War I, they never quite finished that either.
That's right.
Parliament then was cheek by jowl with all of the people that lived in this area. There are not that many people living here now, because it's all just sort of government offices and the National Library and the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church and so on. But at that point, this was quite a teeming area, wasn't it?
Yeah, so there were lots and lots of little shops, lots of bakeries and stables and...
a horse bazaar, you said.
A horse bazaar, that's right.
Drapers and chemists and herbalists and all sorts of things. That's right,
and so people were living above the shops. Almost all shops in Wellington were owned by Wellingtonians. There was very few chains. There was this line of shops all the way down Molesworth Street where the National Library is now.
If you're a couple of blocks west of here towards the ocean, down across what used to be called Thorndon Flat, that's where the really posh people lived, a lot of them. Big houses,
Definitely,
right?
very big houses. Yeah.
But this area here closer to us, between here and there, this block where the new archives building is opened and where the National Library is, that was a little rookery.
It was, so yeah, rookery was a word that was quite often used for it. So there was a really interesting mix of people living in those blocks. There was a really interesting community. At the time they were often called in the newspaper Syrians, but they were actually Lebanese Christians. There's a quite well-known Lebanese Christian community that lived in Dunedin, but found a whole group of them living here in this sort of poverty-stricken area up here. But the other group of people that were living here, there were lots and lots of prostitutes, there were lots of brothels. Ward, as well as drawing the massive great big Parliament buildings, he would come along and actually draw every single tiny little house. And so he would draw a 2-roomed house, not 2 bedrooms, but 2 rooms in total, and its outdoor toilet and everything. So you could see how incredibly packed those blocks were.
They were very, very packed in.
And very, very
Basically
small houses.
Basically a small slum.
Yeah. Between Parliament and what's now Old St Paul's, which is just a block away, was this stretch of brothels. And so there were lots of very unkind jokes about how convenient it was that for all these prostitutes that they were living between the Anglican Cathedral and Parliament, how handy it was. And then the city, particularly under pressure from Seddon, who really hated Wellington City Council's management of the city and didn't think they were doing a good job, they started to do this thing called street widening, which was sort of a euphemism for pulling all the buildings down. And so they built Aitken Street, which we're looking at now, and a whole bunch of the other streets around here in order to justify pulling down those slums.
Just to push out the poor people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found some really interesting people, including one Italian woman who fought the council tooth and nail to get her proper compensation for all the buildings that they had taken away from her. She was a dressmaker and, was really good at standing up for herself against the council to get her money's worth.
Because, again, they demolished everything without actually figuring out what they were going to do afterwards.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah.
You used the word town acres earlier. When Wellington was originally settled, it was cut into great big squares.
Yes.
And if you were one of the early buyer-inners of the Wellington Company, then you got a town acre and a bunch of country acres, which could be a very long way away. But the town acres were almost immediately cut into tiny pieces and sold off or leased to other people. So, in actual fact, this whole area, this whole slum area, would have been the property of one of the rich people in town, I presume.
Yes, possibly, although they may have subdivided it and sold it off in little pieces, but often it was still owned by one owner. The town acres that the New Zealand Company divided the city in were much too big to make a city work. It was a crazy idea, and all the owners created illegal little private streets, and so we had hundreds of tiny little private streets all over the city that the council had never authorised, and because they hadn't authorised them, they wouldn't provide drainage in these private little streets, and so these owners would make their money by having all these little houses built along the private streets and then walk away, and there was no drainage or sewerage.
And that explains Wellington's map today, and some of our water problems probably.
And well, absolutely. So I mentioned the typhoid epidemics, and the reason why we finally got a drainage system put into the city was because of those typhoid epidemics.
It turned out that one person's sewage was just pumping straight down into the next person's kitchen, more or less.
Yes, that's right. It was just soaking into the soil in a lot of cases, or people would pile their sewage up against the neighbour's fence. It was absolutely disgusting. So the people at the city hospital could know when a surge of typhoid cases were going to arrive in the hospital a couple of weeks after a major storm, when the ground got soaked and the sewage had nowhere to go. Because at the time the sewage was just going straight into Wellington Harbour.
That sounds familiar as well.
Yeah, well, exactly. They finally got round, because of this doctor's study of the typhoid, to building Moa Point and
putting that enormous great pipe all the way from Crawley out to
Moa Point. Yeah.
At which point Wellington got generous with the rain and we made for cover. I'm Phil Smith, and I've been chatting with historian Elizabeth Cox, the author of Mr. Ward's Map, Victorian Wellington, Street by Street. A beautiful and fascinating insight into the early and often ugly days of Wellington. You've been listening to The House. E te whakarongo koe ki te whare. This program is produced with funding from Parliament's Office of the Clerk. Mā te wā.